Good morning. I'm Kipp. My pronouns are he, him. I am so excited to be here in the sanctuary and to be joining folks on Zoom. I was really excited to see so many kids up on the stage. It felt like a pandemic. What pandemic? That was amazing. Today's sermon comes very much out of the fact that I love to talk about new things that I've just learned. So you're going to get to hear a new story that I just learned this week myself, or a couple weeks ago, really. But first, our readings. The first reading is a poem by the Syrian-American poet Gilmore-Clough. I'm probably butchering her name, for which I ask her apologies. She said about this poem that she wanted to write a poem expressing an ethic of redistributing resources and creating care and family-like safety nets. So it's a poem about what can be, a poem about what should be, a poem about finding little ways to make the world better. It's called the anti-poem is how I would pronounce it. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be the anti-poem, so I'm going to say the anti-poem, also called Me Privilege es Su Privilege by Gilmore-Clough. I will be your auntie in the new city where you have not yet met a soul. Come to my table and eat. Teach me your pronouns. I will be your auntie who wires you money wherever you are stranded in this world, missed your bus, your flight, when you're passing through. Show me how to outline drama eyes like that. I will be your auntie with old-fashioned button shirts and an ironing board you can borrow for your interview. I will introduce you to whatever board members I know. Introduce me to your artist friends. You'll make me look good at my next meeting. You can unfold my couch. Teach me golden hip moves. I will slip you any privilege I grasp. I am your auntie for life. Here are clean sheets and my spare key. And the Bible reading for this morning is one of the assigned lessons. It comes from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 43. This is what God says. God who made a road through the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who led chariots and warriors to their doom, a mighty army fallen, never to rise again, snuffed out and extinguished like a wick. He's telling the story of the escape from Egypt. She says, forget the events of the past. Ignore the things of long ago. Look, I am doing something new. Now it springs forth. Can't you see it? I'm making a road in the desert and setting rivers to flow in the wasteland. Wild beasts will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches. For I will put water in the desert and rivers in the wasteland for my chosen people to drink, those people whom I formed for myself, so that they might declare my praise. This is God's good news. I just love the random appearance of ostriches in a Bible verse, too. I've never thought of ostriches as biblical stories of ostriches. Oh, this is a story that I learned recently. It starts in Cascade, Montana, population 712, or that's what it was in 2019, the last figure that they have. Who knows what 3 years and a pandemic have done in there. Cascade sits in the middle, roughly, of the state of Montana, and it is the home of St. Peter's Mission Cemetery, which is about all that remains of the mission since it closed up shop in 1938. It had been established by Jesuits in the 1860s. The cemetery is not in Cascade proper, but it sits a bit northwest on Birch Creek. Depending on the source you're looking at, I used Google Maps because I've never been to the state of Montana. But depending on your source, it's either about 14 miles outside of Cascade or about 10 and a half miles outside of Cascade. I suspect the difference has to do with modern roads being constructed in a way that go around hills and mountains rather than straight over them. It was probably a bit trickier in pre-modern road times. That's just a guess, though, because, again, I've never been there. But in that cemetery, there is a modest gravestone popping up out of the lawn. It's got the name Mary Fields, etched onto it. The date's 1832 to 1914. The stone, I'll say, I saw a picture of it. It's a sight better than a lot of the stones in our unfortunate cemetery. But more than a century later, Mary Fields' gravestone attracts at least the occasional visitor coming by to pay respects. Somebody keeps the plot manicured and the flowers fresh more than a century later. Mary Fields was born in Tennessee around 1832. She was born into slavery and emancipated after the Civil War. She found work on a Mississippi River steamboat going up and down the river. That's where she got connected to a Catholic judge named Edmund Dunn. She went to work in his home in Florida. So she's all over the place in these early parts of her life. After his wife died in 1882, his children went to live with his sister in Toledo, Ohio, and Mary Fields went with them. That's how she got connected to the judge's sister, Mother Mary Amadeus, which, what a name, right? Mother Mary Amadeus. She was the mother superior of an Ursuline convent. So a couple years later, Mother Mary Amadeus headed to Montana to start a school at the St. Peter's Mission. While she was there, she got sick with pneumonia, and Mary Fields followed her out there and helped heal her. And she stayed there for the rest of her life. This is what is fun about her, I think. After Mother Mary Amadeus recovered from her pneumonia, Mary Fields stayed there at the mission for work. But it wasn't any shy and retiring kind of work that you might expect at a convent. She took on roles that were widely seen as men's work in the day, such as maintenance, laundry, gardening, coordinating supplies, hauling freight, raising chickens, growing vegetables, repairing buildings. She did it all, and she eventually took on the title of the convent's forewoman. She didn't fit the stereotype that you expect at a convent. She had what one admiring writer refers to as a hearty temperament, which means that she was fond of smoking and drinking and swearing. She also knew her way around a gun. After an incident with a disgruntled male subordinate that involved gunplay, I don't know any details other than that, the bishop barred her from the convent. She wasn't allowed to be there anymore. And so she moved herself into town, and she opened a tavern, which lasted only about 10 months because she had a habit of feeding people who were poor for free. Maybe not the best business model, but it was a great way to be in town. And this is my favorite part of her story. In 1895, she was already more than 60 years old. She took on yet another job. The United States Post Office put out a call for a star route carrier. Those are the folks who would bid on a contract for carrying the mail that wasn't an actual postal route. The contracts would last for 4 years at a time, and Mary Fields won 2 successive contracts running from 1895 to 1903. That had her running the star route, delivering mail back and forth between the town of Cascade and the St. Peter's Mission, where she wasn't supposed to be, according to the bishop. She was the first black woman in the country to work as a mail carrier. For 8 years she did it, riding a stagecoach over the terrain through all kinds of weather, 10.5 miles back and forth between the Mission and Cascade. The nuns at the convent relied on her for it, and they gave her whatever support she needed in the job. It speaks well of them. I think that the bishop generally considered them to be unruly nuns. They're the best kind. Right? Mary Fields carried multiple guns, included a Smith & Wesson .38 tucked up under her apron to protect herself and the mail from wolves and from thieves. Her stagecoach was pulled by a team of horses and by a mule she named Moses. She never missed a day. In 8 years, when the snow was too deep for the horses, she'd strap on snowshoes and walk back and forth with the mail bag slung over her shoulders. She's about 71 when she retired from that star route. But she did not sit idle then. She continued to babysit many of the children in Cascade. She ran a laundry service from her home. If the flowers that still show up on her grave more than a century later don't say enough about how people thought of her in the town, maybe the fact that they closed down the school every year to celebrate her birthday does. Or the fact that when the state of Montana made it illegal for women to go into saloons, the mayor of Cascade granted an explicit exception for Mary Fields. And when her house caught fire in 1912, volunteers rebuilt it. Look, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Can't you see it? I am utterly enchanted by the story of a black woman in 19th century anti-black America hanging out with nuns, breaking social conventions, swearing, drinking, and shooting, upending all of the gender norms, and becoming a postal service pioneer on top of it. A woman who lived through enslavement, through the failures of Reconstruction, through the personal upheavals of loss and displacement, who yet claimed every bit of her sacred being to find water in the deserts and rivers in the wasteland. Heck, to be waters in the desert and rivers in the wasteland. Now, I don't want to diminish her complexity, but I think her story is one that is worth knowing. After all, someone is still keeping her grave flowers fresh. It's a story, to me, that speaks of the power of hope, not of naive optimism, not a willful blindness to the painful and terrible realities of the world, but the power of claiming a sacred center in the middle of all of it, the sense that every sign and symbol of life's futility, no matter how strongly they sing in chorus, still do not get the last word. There will yet be benediction. Hope that there is a pathway forward, that there is a reason to keep moving, that there might yet be a way where there seems to be no way. That's the message that Israel held on to as well. That is reflected in today's Bible reading. This section of Isaiah captures the voice of a people living in exile. Isaiah's people who are a people who had a story of being held in captivity in Egypt for generations before escaping and wandering through the desert and finally settling in the land. There was a brief shining period where they were together as one nation before the nation fractured. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire swooped in, conquered the northern kingdom, carried some of the people off to a new place. It was a short-lived triumph for them. The southern kingdom looked on nervously, feeling its vulnerability all the more keenly. And in 586, after the Babylonian Empire defeated Assyria, they swooped into the southern kingdom, conquered it, carried the people off to new places. This is the context of this reading, with all of its insistence on pathways through wilderness and water in wastelands. It looks backward to a remembered deliverance and says out of sheer cussedness and trust that by God there will be another deliverance. There just has to be. This isn't a text that rises above and ignores the suffering and the hopelessness of life. It speaks from in the thick of it and insists that there is still reason to hope, and in fact that hope is the best and the truest option. And it's a text that was held onto and lifted up not only in its own period of suffering and hopelessness, but also after the next turn of history's wheel, when one empire gave way to the next, gave way to the next, gave way to the next, when the cycles of history would seem to make cynicism and hopelessness the best and most reasonable posture. Still, Isaiah says and still the people read, and still the people proclaim, there will be pathways, there will be water. I've spoken once or twice about Nick Cave, who's an artist, whose musician I love, and whose growth as a human being I am entirely entranced by. He started in his youth inhabiting a music and a lifestyle that was self-destructive and nihilistic, and was very much a response to the pressures of a dehumanizing society and economic order. But over several decades, he has become far more thoughtful and grounded. In recent years, he's even started an email newsletter in which he invites fans from all over the world to send in questions. And he'll send, probably once a week, he sends out a response to some of those questions. This week, he responded to a question from one of his fans who asked him about cynicism as a response to the world's senselessness and violence. And I liked what he said so much, I'm going to read most of it. He said, "Cynicism is not a neutral position. And although it asks almost nothing of us, it is highly infectious and unbelievably destructive. In my view, it's the most common and easy of evils." And he continues, it's an easy posture, isn't it? To say, well, the world stinks and there's nothing we can do about it. So, take that. This is what he says. "I know this because of my early life was spent holding the world and the people in it in contempt. It was a position both seductive and indulgent. The truth is, I was young and had no idea what was coming down the line. I lacked the knowledge, the foresight, the self-awareness. I just didn't know. It took a devastation." And here he's talking about the death of his teenage son about a decade ago, which would lead you to cynicism, perhaps. He says, "It took a devastation to teach me the preciousness of life and the essential good of people. It took a devastation to reveal the precariousness of the world, of its very soul, to understand that it was crying out for help. It took a devastation to understand the idea of mortal value, and it took a devastation to find hope." Perhaps that's the same hope that Isaiah held forth. He continues, "I never expected Nick Cave would be my preacher, but I'm really cribbing his notes today." He said, "Unlike cynicism, hopefulness is hard-earned, makes demands upon us, and can often feel like the most indefensible and lonely place on earth. Hopefulness is not a neutral position either. It is adversarial. It is the warrior emotion that can lay waste to cynicism. Each redemptive or loving act, as small as you like, such as reading to your little boy, or showing him a thing you love, or singing him a song, or putting on his shoes, keeps the devil down in the hole. It says the world and its inhabitants have value and are worth defending. It says the world is worth believing in. In time, we come to find that it is so." I don't know what Mary Fields would have made of Nick Cave. I don't know how consciously she would have called on this passage from Isaiah. I do know she was a black woman living in a nation riddled with anti-blackness who resisted that by living out her own sacredness. And I'm pretty sure she would not be surprised to know that more than a century later, someone keeps her grave flowers fresh. This is God's good news. Amen.